agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome back to The Politics Guys.
Hey, Trey, it is great to be back.
It is fun to be back. It's fun to be because we always have the best weeks, and that is why we get all the best stories. And I'm assuming that is, in fact, a result of supernatural power in our favor. But be that as it may, on a less funny note, we kind of had the stories ready to go for this week. And then this morning I walk into school. I was walking into campus, and my wife, who rarely shares things with me, she sent me a text and she said, "I'm sure you've already seen this, but..." And it was the death of Dianne Feinstein this morning at age 90. And the answer was I hadn't seen it. It actually had come out while I was walking over here to campus. And so I thought we'd kind of start with that, Ken, since that's something new that's been going on here. And again, I mean, this isn't going to be a surprise to listeners. I had a lot of disagreements with her policies, but that doesn't mean that I don't have admiration for her as well on a number of fronts. So just to list some of those things, Ken, she's the first woman to hold a number of important political roles in the U.S. Senate, including the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, the Senate Select Committee, which was huge. She's also the longest serving woman in the Senate and the longest serving senator from California. I mean, again, you're 90. That's kind of what happens when you're there. I'll say the one area for which I will always have a large amount of respect for Feinstein was her 6,700 page report in the aftermath of 9/11, which was multi-year process of looking at what was at that time called those enhanced interrogation methods used by the CIA to try to uncover quote unquote critical intelligence. And what she uncovered effectively was that nothing ever really came useful that could even begin to balance the horrific treatment of those prisoners. And so that was one area where, I think that report will stand as one of a across the border or across the aisle area where I think she did some of her absolute best work. And so, yeah, but I mean, of course, that also brings us, we've been talking about this online and we've talked about on the show, the kind of the downside here is one of the areas where I've been outspoken is to say, yeah, I think people need to do what Mitch Romney did and step back before you're 90. And so this leaves obviously as well a political fight to be finished, right? I mean, the Thursday night Feinstein's dead, and already, Governor Gavin Newsom from California has to figure out what his replacement's going to be, and there is sure to be a spirited battle on that front. And we already know that he doesn't have the same 5 weeks he had to replace Kamala Harris. And so Ken, what are your thoughts on Feinstein?
Yeah, you said all the nice things about her long career, and I certainly agree about all of it. She was a great pioneer. She did great work working with Senator John McCain, in fact, on the report, the torture report. But I do think it's been a couple years, now she should have retired. She did a really great harm to her constituents, great harm to the U.S. Senate, and I would say because of how closely divided the Senate has been, some harm to the whole American people by hanging on into her period of dementia, which she's basically been in, and it's a problem. And I like your looking at Romney as someone who's, leaving on a note of dignity. Now, I'm sure he also, would be facing a very contentious. He would have been reelected, but he would have had a lot of mud slung at him by all the Trumpers if he ran for reelection. And I'm sure that's nothing he relished. And Feinstein doesn't really have to deal with that exactly. But it isn't really good when people are hanging on beyond the point where they can show up for work or where they can keep paying attention. And it's also going to create a huge problem in California Democratic politics now, because you got the governor who already had to make one replacement because Kamala Harris got reelected and then gave up her seat to become vice president. And so Gavin Newsom already made one appointment. That was a bit of a free-for-all where identity politics became a big thing. And when he did give it to a Latino man, he promised that if he gets to fill another vacancy, it will be with an African-American woman. And now he's in this kind of situation where there's already a bunch of primary contenders for Feinstein's seat. One of them is an African-American woman, and he's which is Representative Barbara Lee, and he's got to decide to keep the promise that he made. If he puts Barbara Lee in, then he's really putting his finger on the scale in the emerging primary race.
Let's be honest, his hand,
yeah, his hand, not just his finger. I think in a way that is not what he wanted to do. I think he wanted to maintain neutrality in that, and my sense is that he will appoint an African-American woman, and that it will not be Representative Barbara Lee. It'll be someone who will probably commit not to run in the primary to keep the seat, because I think the factional politics within the California Democratic Party, Newsom wants to try to stay out of that as best he can and not wade into it. So that's what I think he'll do. But it is a little bit of a mess. And when you think about what we're going to talk about later in the show today, what's going on in Washington right now today, it's not a good time for the Senate to be shorthanded.
Yeah, I can't help but draw some comparisons to what effectively happens at the end of Truman's presidency, where his wife is effectively the one and his doctor are effectively the ones who are making things work. And we look at that as being a problem, and it was. And yet, when it comes to the Senate and maybe even the presidency in the future, we just seem to be wanting to set ourselves up on that front again and again. And it is unfortunate because, again, like I said, I did not agree with all of Feinstein's policies, but yet I did have, again, as we were talking about, I think that work on torture will go down as one of the most important works of hers in the Senate. You hate to have to see those kinds of things overshadowed a little bit because of the way you end, but that is what happens when you can't find the graceful exit at the end when you're doing it. And this leads me to something else I was curious about, Ken, that I think we can move on in terms of Newsom and replacing the seat. Do you think that he made a mistake in trying to say definitively, like, this is the kind of person on attributes that I'm going to appoint no matter what? And again, I'm someone, we've had a lot of agreement when it comes to understanding systematic and institutionalized racism. But at the same time, I can't help but feel that coming out in that way is counterproductive, and it backs you into the kind of corners that you were just talking about. So what did you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say, we talked about this before because President Biden had made a similar promise about the U.S. Supreme Court appointment, and then he kept it and he appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's I think a extremely highly qualified candidate. In fact, probably more qualified than most of the other people on the court.
But that, of course, is very different than in this. Yep. That's a different kind of promise.
Exactly. Right. I was going to say, I actually, even though I think he was able to keep that promise in a way that turned out, kind of all's well that ends well. I think it is more problematic on a court actually than in an elected position. Yeah, because I think for a court, really the concept that kind of justice is blind, which I think is a good one, seems to me a little bit at odds with that kind of identity politics. Whereas
because you're not representing anybody in the way
you're not representing it, right? You're representing the law, and the law should be the same for everyone. I know it's not, but I think that's a concept that if we want to get there, it's kind of better to start working using the right kind of language and working towards it. And whereas I think ordinary politics, electoral politics, and especially in the Democrats now, it's a coalition, and so coalition partners want to be part of the power sharing. And to me, it's not so much, you talked about the maybe some kind of remediation for the history of discrimination and things like that. To me, there's also just the element of this is a constituency that's a major constituency in the modern Democratic Party. It does a lot of the heavy lifting that helps get Democrats elected. And it wants its own representatives to have a role in the governing coalitions, and I think that's legitimate. So I think it's actually doesn't bother me as much that he made a promise like that. In this case, he's making it to a group that's helping get him elected and get senators elected. That they'll have a role in the governance. So I think that's okay. I just think it's a little bit unfortunate right now, because there's actually, there's a seat that was already going to be an open seat because Feinstein had already said she was not going to run for re-election again. And there's already a primary battle going on. Right. And there is exactly one person in that group. And I think who's an African-American woman. That to me is a highly unfortunate situation. But if it wasn't for that particular situation, I wouldn't think this was that bad of a thing.
I hear that. Well, why don't we move forward with what we had originally thought that we were going to be chatting about at the beginning of this show. So again, kind of our thoughts and prayers to the family of everyone and the staff surrounding Dianne Feinstein. But what we need to move to, Ken, is the GOP debate. So this week, obviously, the big item on the debate, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but we'll get there. Was the second GOP debate, and this time happening out at the Ronald Reagan Library. And that's out in California. But again, people may not remember is that Reagan was actually a California governor once upon a time before he launched that bid. Times change. Now, what makes this kind of hard in one sense, and so before we get into the details of what the arguments were and what the arguments maybe weren't and the bickering was, it's hard as an observer to not just do the math, right? And if you do the math, and this has been circulating, it's not, if you take all eight GOP candidates who are not named Trump, and you created out of them a single candidate who is taking on Trump, that only gives you 36.5% of the vote. Meanwhile, Trump is sitting on 56.6% of the vote. So what that means is if you take all eight candidates, all eight of them, mush them Plato style into a single candidate, they would still be losing by more than 20 percentage points to Trump. The closest individual who was at the debate, and that's DeSantis, sits at 14.4%. It's just nothing. And so, Ken, obviously for me, the very first thing, it was very hard to not be asking myself as I was watching the debate, as I've been looking at the analysis of the debate, to just say, oh, here's the kids' table. Why am I paying a lot of attention to that? Yeah. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I guess I do in one sense. I don't mean to suggest that I want Trump. I mean, obviously, I am in the kind of the never Trump GOP column. And so I get that. So I'm not sitting here. It's not a rah-rah, but I'm also an empirical guy, right? And I don't see historical precedent for an individual to be overcome on that kind of deficit when all of the candidates combined are down by that many points. And so, when I'm watching them at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, it's hard for me not to think, I think they've kind of missed it. Now, only 7 were there, of course, because not everybody had even the numbers for the debate. And so meanwhile, Trump, he actually headed out to meet with union workers at his own event in Michigan. And, this is something, and I'm going to plug actually yesterday, this week, I was able to talk with scholar Lainey Newman, along with her co-author, Theda Skocpol, on their brand new book, Union Blues, which was precisely about this. And I couldn't help. I was like, wow, this was perfect timing, because union members at the ground level have turned significantly Trumpian, and that's what their book is primarily about. And so it was hard not to see this and go, okay, we've got the kids' table that hasn't figured it out. They're there primarily kind of bickering with one another. And Trump is doing what many Republicans would have done for a long time, do things with unions and has supports there. And So again, Trump's always looming over the GOP debate, but for me, it was really hard to not just see that presence everywhere and not really have as much vested interest in it in one way, because I just don't see a path forward. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, Ken. What do you think?
Well, you're not wrong. I didn't
listen. When we agree, it has to be right.
I couldn't even watch the debate, and partly because it would just give me a headache, but partly because it's so pointless. I think that we could talk about some contingencies that didn't happen, right? I mean, I think many of these candidates early on, because they're all mostly all cowardly, they made a calculation that they didn't want to be the one to go after Trump. They just hoped somebody else would go after Trump, and then they'd be the one that could stand to inherit. They would stand to inherit Trump's voters if Trump was taken down. But since everyone decided to do that, except for Christie and Hutchinson, both of whom have no constituency whatsoever, and actually those were the two who weren't looking to inherit Trump's voters. They were looking to see if there's other Republican voters who are anti-Trump that they could get. But I think given that that's how the rest of them decided to operate, I'm going to just be pro-Trump, and then when Trump falls away, his voters will like me because I was so pro-Trump. That's not actually a way to get rid of Trump, and so they still, I guess, are gambling on a couple of other contingencies. It's possible that Trump actually goes to prison before the election. It's possible that Trump, who's not really in good shape, has a heart attack and gets physically incapacitated or dies before the election. And then I think, one of these people that we're calling the kids table would probably become the nominee if something like that happens. But if none of those contingencies happen, then Trump's gonna be the nominee. And I think some of them have already actually switched to they're really running for the vice presidential nomination. And Vivek, more than any of the others, I think, is very blatantly at this point running for the vice presidential nomination. So I think that's really all that's going on. It's going to be Trump's nomination unless health or incarceration takes him out of it. The other thing you said, though, I just wanted to one thing I didn't agree about. You said he spoke to union workers. You should never believe anything Trump says. He didn't speak to any union workers. And the Detroit News ran an article today where they tried to figure out who those 500 people in the crowd were. And the speech took place at a non-union workplace. The leaders of the United Auto Workers unions and other unions, told their members not to go. And when the Detroit News started asking for names of people who was there and where they worked, nobody that organized the talk would help them at all. And when they launched their own, just put it out a call there, like, if you were one of the people at this event, let us know. There's only one single person they heard from, a 55-year-old union auto worker named Doug King, who works for a company called Stellantis, who was there. And to this day, right now, after this Detroit News article came out, nobody's identified even one more labor union member who was among the 500 people in the audience.
Fascinating. I will say, to come back to that conversation we'd had, I didn't know the details of that, but there is a major split when it comes to voting in the with unions between Trump and Biden that has not existed in the past. So I don't know that specific event, but at the union worker level, Trump is relatively popular.
Yeah, I think he did get a lot of votes in Michigan in
Pennsylvania.
16. In 16. I mean, but those are states that both those states he won in 16. He lost in 20. My sense is that his stock is dropping with union labor in those states compared to where it was. But certainly he was doing well with them. But I think I find it actually pretty telling that he wasn't doing well enough even with those people now that he could actually speak to 500. He couldn't find 500 union workers, or even more than one, who wanted to show up to see him at this speech.
Yeah, it's hard to analyze that because, again, my guess is you've probably never been to a Trump event.
No, I've never been to a Trump event.
I have actually been to a Trump event in person. And the thing I was struck with, even in his first run, was the absolute comparatively chaotic nature of how those events went down. Like, you theoretically had tickets, but you don't really have tickets. In all honesty, having been up close and personal on a couple of those, I am inclined to, my first would just say, that seems like the order of business for the way that the Trump campaign has zero idea on a pragmatic level of what they do. Like when you go to one of those events, Ken, it was the weirdest thing on that front. And I've done a lot of in-person events with candidates. And generally, when you have tickets and things, it's in part because they want to know who's there and what's going on. The Trump event had no idea. They just kind of passed out these things online. They didn't keep track of it. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little interesting story. The one in Florida, I actually ended up getting into. We got in even after they were theoretically full because I just kind of kept talking with the next security guard through the lines, and got me and a couple other people from our institution in. That would never have happened at any other kind of event I was in, even for like lower level political figures. So again, I'm not suggesting that what you're saying couldn't be the case. But having been up close and personal on several of them, I can just imagine that this actually has more to do with just the absolute chaotic way that his team handles these events than even anything else. Like, we have union members. I don't know who was here. I have no idea who got a ticket. I don't know. I can believe that.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I don't think it applies to this situation because this was not a public event. This took place actually in an auto parts factory, right? So that was not at all open to the public. So the auto parts manufacturer is Drake Enterprises. Drake is a Trump supporter. This is a non-union workplace. Nobody who works there is in a union, and Drake says, Trump can come speak to the workers here in this non-union shop, and it's not actually opened up to just whoever wants to come in. And then, if the Trump campaign, wanted to get people in there who were in unions, none worked there, so they would have had to be reaching out either to unions or to people who are in unions and trying to find out, who's in a union and can we get them here, which would have meant they would have had that information. And then what you also have here is the Detroit News did not rely only on the Trump campaign's information. After the Trump campaign couldn't tell them any union workers who were there, they, sent the reporters out to try to find out who was there, and they put it in the paper and on the website. We're just trying to find out if any union workers were there. If you're a union worker who was there, we want to talk to you.
You just get the one guy.
Yeah, they only got one guy. So it just seems to me very implausible that there were more union workers there because, first of all, they probably should have been invited by somebody who knew they were union members for them to be there in the first place. And second of all, even if any just sort of came over and showed up because they're big Trump supporters and they're in a union, why wouldn't they want to stand up and tell the Detroit News that? If it's being questioned whether any union workers were there and you're a pro-Trump union worker who was there, why wouldn't you want to, tamp down that questioning by saying, yeah, I was there?
No, I mean, I don't have enough to push one way or the other on that. So, yeah, I hear you. So now I think this brings us to one last little bit of Trump for a minute. And that's something that really I think some of their other co-hosts wanted us to get on, Ken, and that was the odds of Trump beating Biden, right? So I think many of our fellow hosts think that the two of us are maybe a little too optimistic, maybe, that Trump can't win. I'm not sure why. I don't know. We need to explore this because I'm not sure if I haven't made much of a prediction on this front yet. And for me, that's at least because it's been early for making predictions. But where a lot of this comes from, and again, a lot of this also comes from our Discord, has been that this week, the Washington Post had a poll where Trump beat Biden by 10 points. Now, a lot on the left have kind of poo-pooed. Let's be clear, there are some potential issues with that poll. However, if you go over to the general election matchups at Real Clear Politics, as of at least today, that's Friday, right now, there is a dead tie among the poll of polls between Trump and Biden. 45.4 to 44.3. So Trump is up, we'll put that in quotes, 1.1 points, but that's within the meta margin of error. But then you start digging in a little bit deeper, right? You take a look at things like the direction of the country, those who approve of Biden, right? So you look at the direction of the country, 41.4%. That's a statistical tie for how voters view Trump, a tie. And then you look at things like, is the country on a wrong track? 67% of respondents say the country is on a wrong track. I mean, those are really terrible, terrible numbers for any incumbent. And really the only good news on that kind of polling front this week, just yesterday, was an Economist YouGov poll that came out. And I think gave Biden supporters some hope. It shows Biden up by 5, which is a lead over where he had been in that poll in the past. But as Politico has noted, Biden had a 9.5 point lead over Trump at the meta level of polling by this point in the race, and a double-digit lead in the polls from Fox News at this point in the race. And yet here we are, statistically tied. So, and again, if the GOP debates primarily the kids' table, and Vivek is running to be Biden's new vice president.
Trump's new vice president, not Biden.
It seems like that is that a plausibility? What do you think? I just made a point right there. Is it a plausibility, Ken? There's a new word for you.
That is a tale of sound and fury that signifies nothing. Polling this far out from an election means nothing. There's no method you could use to predict who's going to win the 2024 election that would be less credible than using a poll that's taken more than a year before the election. You could read the entrails of shrimp's intestines like the Romans used to do, and that would be more accurate than relying on polling 6 to 8 or what are we now 14, 15 months out. I just wouldn't. It doesn't mean anything. You have to look at the fundamentals. Almost every election that's happened since 2018, Democrats have overperformed polls, and that's because of Trump. Trump has he's got a very toxic and malignant impact on elections. Any elections that are close, if he picks one candidate, that candidate will lose. He has not acquitted himself since January 6th of 2021 in a way, where if you're thinking there's people who voted for Biden in that election, there's nothing that Trump's done since then that's going to make any of them say, oh, you know what, Trump's really convinced me by now. His death threats against General Milley and stuff, that's what's going to make me go vote for Trump now. So I think it's just nonsense. Also, some of the states that were close in 16 and even a little bit close in 20, some of the key states like Michigan and Pennsylvania are moving further and further into the blue column. So I see no path that Trump could possibly have. And when you talk about the low approval ratings that Biden has, and that may never change, you've got to remember that a lot of those people that are giving him low approval ratings are giving him that from his left. So those people would never consider voting for Trump. If it's a fixed choice, Trump or Biden, and you've got, people who would really prefer to see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez be the president, they're going to give Biden a very low approval rating, and they're going to vote for him. So it doesn't. I think none of the fundamentals have changed even in the slightest.
All I'll say is I do agree that we are really early to try to understand those those up and up polls. And you're absolutely right on that front. The one area where I'm going to have a little bit of disagreement as a presidential scholar is to say that those country right and wrong track kind of questions do, during a president's term, give us some indication of how their reelection chances are. So it doesn't tell us a lot about particular matchups, but I think I hear your argument is effectively because we know it's Trump, you can interpret them in a way that is slightly different than what you might do under normal circumstances. But I do fully agree with you that in that year to 14-month timeline, those kinds of matchup polls are way too early to have any kind of deep meaning. But I will say, and that's why I was curious about those other numbers, and wanted to dig into that, those kind of wrong track, approving of Bidenomics, what do you think of economy? Those kinds of numbers are significantly correlated with in the difficult, you might even give it like a difficulty factor for the incumbent. And so on that front, I do see those matching up. And the last thing I'll say on that front is just to say that I still think it's too early for me to give an honest and be okay with myself as a scholar position on, who's going to win or lose. So there's me. Any last thoughts on that, Ken?
I'm trying to think. You said so much there. I think. I guess I don't. Well, no, I'll leave it at that actually, because I think I said everything before, so I'll just leave it at that.
I hear you. Well, we're gonna stop for just a brief moment. We'll be right back. Okay, so Ken, I think it's time to move on to something that we've already covered on the show, but of course, today, tomorrow, we've got a deadline, and that is the spending and the shutdown threat that is coming from the House. As a matter of fact, just minutes before we started recording, we were still getting up to date on the absolute newest things that were happening. And so let's talk a little bit about this and the most recent developments on that front. And so what has happened since Mike and May had their opportunity to have a conversation about this a little bit earlier on was the Senate has now passed a bill, and they were trying to hope to have something ready to go as soon as the House eventually brought something over. I mean, something to keep in mind about this, it's not unusual. If you were to read the news, it's not unusual to have these spending and these debt increases kind of coming down to the wire. But what would be different is this oftentimes then gets punted into the Christmas area, right? I mean, I think now, if you take a look at historically speaking, we've seen this now happening for, a decade-ish, if I've done my numbers correct. But it is a great news pusher. Now, but what makes this different is the odds for a shutdown as of today on Friday. It's really high. I believe, if I understand the timing correct, Ken, before the show, you and I were kind of making sure we had our notes right on this. I believe that it's Saturday night that if we don't get the short-term funding bill passed by then, that we move into shutdown. And so the other new thing, which happened just here on Friday, just a few minutes ago, is that 20 Republicans, just a scooch over 20 Republicans actually, joined Democrats in opposing a significant bill for Speaker Kevin McCarthy as he attempted to kind of navigate some of the Freedom Caucus and others over these spending issues. And he had already in this bill floated a number of items that he hoped was going to bring them on board. As a matter of fact, it included items like no funding for Ukraine. It included some items about bringing salaries down to $1. It actually had a 30% slashing of the federal government in an attempt to try to really get those kind of conservatives on board. But despite that, it was not able to happen. And now, despite the setback, McCarthy has been saying, as of, again, just a few minutes ago, that there's still a chance. And he said, look, you've watched me time and again, and have you ever known me to quit after one time if it doesn't succeed, end quote. I mean, obviously talking about his own speakership, but he faces a lot of problems. As a matter of fact, he didn't get, and this was, I think, telling to me, he didn't get Green on board this time, which was one of the people he had on his path to the speakership. And I think Gatz has been really straightforward with the American public. I mean, I don't like the guy, but he's being straightforward. He doesn't want anything to move forward, the end, because his fundamental problem is with McCarthy. He does not want McCarthy with the speaker's gavel. And again, the majority is so slim. I don't think there's really anything McCarthy can offer to Gatz that's going to get him to get his vote. And so unless he can convince some Democrats to get on board, I don't see a path forward. But the problem with that is if he tries to get Democrats on board, he's going to lose a lot of his moderate Republicans. And so I think that we are now this time, unlike other years where when we've talked about this, we're like, look, they're going to get it done before the end. I think it's likely we at least have a few days, at least, of shutdown. Ken, thoughts?
Yeah, that all sounds just about right to me. It maybe just I might have a few differences in terms of which is the horse and which is the cart.
Yeah,
some of the things that you said, but basically agree with what you said. But I actually think the shutdown is the goal. So I think what you were saying is that the if you think about the Freedom Caucus people, their goal would be to replace McCarthy, and their shutdown would be the mechanism to do that. Whereas I think the shutdown itself is the goal. goal, and they're kind of actually indifferent about whether they maybe replace McCarthy or not. In fact, I don't know who they would want to replace him with. I don't think they could. Not only do I think they could not replace him with one of their own Freedom Caucus members because they wouldn't get a majority vote within the Republicans, but I actually think they wouldn't want to replace him with one of their own Freedom Caucus members, because I think that their whole game is kind of running against the powers that be. If they were the powers that be, they still wouldn't be able to achieve any of their agenda, and they wouldn't be able to blame it on anybody else. So, I think having the ability to have someone like McCarthy in there who's really trying to give them everything they want as best he can, and then calling him a rhino and blaming him for all the dysfunction, I think that the Freedom Caucus people are better served by that. And I think the reason we're having the shutdown is primarily because they want the shutdown. And the reason they want the shutdown is because it's both a performative thing to show that they basically are against the government. They don't think government does much. They don't think people are going to care that there's a shutdown. They think they're going to prove that government's unnecessary, and also that it will hinder they think it will hinder the Biden administration. And then if there's a lot of chaos and dysfunction because of a government shutdown during the Biden years, then they'll be able to run against the chaos and dysfunction, even though they caused it. So I guess I would say that the shutdown itself is the object of what's going on. But in a way, it's comes out to the same place you are. And I think this shutdown will be longer than a few days. I think it could go a month or something.
So I understand the cart and the horse, and so let's argue about that a little bit, since that's where we have a little bit of space,
Yeah.
And I'll say one of the things to keep in mind is it's not the totality of the Freedom Caucus. As a matter of fact, this past week, if you want to get really inside baseball, the Freedom Caucus actually changed some of their rules for how they're voting on things. And to me, as an insider, when you take a look at that change, what I see is the primary goal of the majority of the Freedom Caucus seems to be the replacement of McCarthy. And then I see as part of that group, there's this subgroup who are the shutdown individuals. And I think that the Gats, Boebert, Green, what they see as being the shutdown is kind of two birds with one stone. At the one hand, you get to take a really powerful stance against spending, while at the same time you bring down the guy you don't really want to have. As a matter of fact, the early morning chatter here on Friday was that they were already kind of circling around McCarthy's number two when it comes to putting him in. Now, that would agree with you a little bit on the front was I don't think they want one of their own. But again, I think you really have to understand the Freedom Caucus as being two related but separate circles, right? You've kind of got, and I think it's easy to confuse the two groups because Gats, Green, Boebert, they get all of the attention, they get all of the media coverage because they're the loud, bombastic Trump types. But they're the subgroup in there who really wants to have the two birds, and they want McCarthy out. And I think that's what's causing these kinds of weird votes in ways that you wouldn't anticipate them. And I think it's also how you explain why you get more than half the Freedom Caucus voting for this, but then you have this smaller subset voting against it, even though McCarthy, as you've rightfully pointing out, are trying to put things in like defunding Ukraine and those overall spending cuts that I don't think are as popular across the board. And so that's why I put the horse in the cart a little bit differently there. Yeah.
And actually, I think that's why in the end, even though we're both maybe still putting different emphasis on what's the horse and what the cart, our bottom line comes out the same, because I agree with you. If they could take McCarthy down and put in his own deputy, I feel like that's a bit of theater that they'd be happy for that, because they'd flex their muscles and say, we took a speaker down. Yeah. But it's not if they're just putting in his own deputy, it's not achieving any substantive change, really. So it's only about the theater, and it's only about the shutdown. That it's not like McCarthy's doing anything where they want someone else in there because that person will do something different. If they make the substitution that you talk about, that's not going to happen. There is no issue where McCarthy is opposing them and McCarthy's deputy is going to be on their side. And another reason I think that the shutdown shutdown is the goal, even as recently as a couple days ago when we were already on this collision course into the shutdown. You mentioned spending, but they were actually still debating amongst themselves about whether that's the issue, or maybe they ought to change the issue to border security or something. And they weren't even, they were all more clear on the fact that we got to make some impossible demands that the Democrats will refuse, so that we can then have a shutdown. And they were still not clear about which was the demand they really wanted to make the most.
Well, no, and I think that comes back in part to the kind of the Gatz, Green, and the Bobart function of that wing. And I maybe for better or for worse, I mean, because, and this is something I've thought about a lot, right? You were talking about the show of it. There is a lot of work in political science. A lot of it goes back to this guy named David Mayhew, who effectively first argues that if you want to explain the behavior of Congress, you have to understand that everybody's trying to get reelected. And once you understand everybody's trying to get reelected, you have to understand it's kind of things like position taking that is more important with the public when it comes to voting, when you look at the actual numbers, than the kinds of things that you actually do. And so I can't help but wonder if either the accidental, kind of you have enough people do enough things and you finally land on it, or the strategy here from kind of the Gatz, Bobart, and Green wing of the party is effectively to say, look, the way you become relevant is through having highly publicized moments where you're taking positions, because that, again, in the literature suggests one of the most highly correlated reasons for people to win re-election, not kind of what you would think of as being the down and dirty of passing stuff. So again, that's not to say that I think that, okay, yay, that's what we ought to do. But it might explain empirically why you'd have that conversation. Because I think when we have that conversation and you say that, and I think you rightfully say it from a place of look, that's nuts. Okay, what's going to be the thing that we think is the most important for the shutdown? Is it border security, or is it the deficit? Which one? But it makes a lot of sense if you think, okay, the primary goal here is to get reelected, and the primary goal is to have an issue, a high-profile issue on which you're taking a stance.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree with that. So I think again, everything you said, I basically agreed with. I was just sort of having a different perspective on how you get there. Yeah.
See, I guess that's always the problem, Ken. We agree about too many things, and so I mean that's what happens when you look at the empirical world. And
one other thing, Trey, as I was just looking while we're talking at the list of who the 21 are, there are a few outliers among the 21 Republicans. So they're actually not all, as you pointed out, which I hadn't realized, that not everyone in the Freedom Caucus voted no on today's bill.
Right, exactly.
But the other thing is, not every Republican who voted no on today's bill is in the Freedom Caucus. And so someone like Nancy Mace, who's been positioning herself more in the center, not in the far right, she also voted no on this bill. And
it could be in part because she doesn't like some of the takes towards the right.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's a number of names here I don't actually know. So I don't know some of these people like Eric Burleson or Eli Crane. I wouldn't know if they were in the Freedom Caucus or not, or Alex X. Mooney. But at least I certainly do know Nancy Mace's name, and she struck me as one prominent Republican centrist who voted on the side of the Freedom Caucus, and of course all the Democrats voted on that side also. They all voted no on the bill as well.
Right. Now, I mean, and that was a little bit more to be expected. But then I think what's going to start coming up then becomes can there be anything that ends up being the pass? And at this juncture, I'm not sure what that is. Because again, for McCarthy, I'm not sure what he puts forward that then stops him from getting ousted. If my analysis is right about what that subset wants to do. But, well, Ken, maybe what we should do is move forward and talk a little bit about this week in New York. So this week, a New York judge found that the Trump organization committed fraud. Justice Ergon of New York ruled that Trump and his co-defendants, a lot of his family, committed fraud and ordered the cancellation of certificates that some of his businesses need to operate in New York. Now, the ruling would only affect 10 of roughly his 500 entities, but that includes a number of his primary entities. Now, what this ultimately means is that an independent receiver would need to operate or liquidate the businesses in question. Trump team's already saying he's going to appeal. But if it goes to court, which it is scheduled to, this would be in terms of just what the fine the Trump organization would have to pay, which is somewhere in the realm of $250 million. This kind of civil issue can be a little bit confusing. Ken, what are we missing, and what do we need to think about on those fronts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked me that, because I as much as I kind of love the way these cases are going, and I'd really love to see Trump held as accountable as all that. I think some of the reporting on this has overstated how much has already happened and how much is still got to happen. So the judge granted what's called a partial summary judgment. So the partial summary judgment means he found that there are some issues where all the evidence is on one side and there's actually no evidence on the other side. And so something like that doesn't need to go to a jury.
And that comes, if I understand, because I want to be clear about this, because this interested me. It's because even in the material provided by the party, there's no other countervailing evidence, correct? In other words, you had a chance to present it, and everything you gave me doesn't give. Did I understand that part of that right?
Right. So for instance, if you're talking about something like the valuation of Mar-a-Lago, where the tax assessor says Mar-a-Lago is worth $19 million. That's the property tax base that he's paying property tax on, and Trump says it's worth $500 million. So you've got a factual dispute. Is it worth 19 million, or is it worth 500 million, or is it worth something else? Now the prosecutor, I call them prosecutors, but this is actually a civil case.
Right,
it's the New York Attorney General's office. They're not really prosecutors, but the New York Attorney General's office, put in some evidence, not just the fact that the Palm Beach County tax assessor says that it's worth 19 million, but they put in like comparable sales evidence and stuff you'd see on Zillow and this and that. And they actually acknowledged, it might be worth more than 19 million. It might be worth as much as 50 million, but it's definitely not worth 500 million. Trump just put in zero evidence on that. Like he put in no evidence whatsoever about how he came up with the valuation of 500 million. So the judge basically says, well, if you would have presented some evidence that this is actually worth 500 million, and you had some basis for saying that, then we could have put that in front of a jury, and you could have made that argument, and the New York Attorney General could have argued it's worth a lot less, and they could have decided whether your number was fraudulent or not. But since you just didn't put in any, you've presented literally nothing to back up your valuation, and the New York Attorney General has presented a great deal of evidence of all types that are related to how property gets valued. There's nothing to submit to the jury. So that's the partial summary judgment. That's a very ordinary part of civil litigation that at the beginning of civil cases, judges, the parties get to do discovery. They get to subpoena each other and take depositions from each other and make each other produce documents, and they present each other with what they've got. And at that stage, there could certainly be conflicts in the evidence, which are the kinds of things that go to a jury. But on issues where only one side has any evidence and the other side is making claims that they can't support with any evidence, then that doesn't go to a jury. And as I say, this is a very normal part of how kind of all civil litigation proceeds. Now, in this case, the Attorney General's office said there's this large number of properties where Trump has told his lenders and investors and creditors that the property is worth a whole ton of money, and then for the exact same property, he's told the taxation authorities that it's worth hardly any money, and usually it's somewhere in between, but closer to the low end that he's telling the tax people than to the high end that he's telling the banks and the creditors. And so because there was such a pattern of that, and because Trump put in no evidence to explain where he was getting these high valuations from, in fact, he put in some legal argumentation which was bogus, which said I just made these up, but I'm allowed to make them up because I put some disclaimer on there saying that I'm not sure if these are accurate or not, and that was basically his argument. The judge said, well, as a matter of law, that's not a defense to fraud. You can't just make stuff up and then have a get out of fraud free card by saying, but I'm not sure that what I just made up is accurate. So this is all resolved, and the the AG asked for 250 million, and a lot of in fact, the AG asked for a minimum of 250 million. It could be more according to the complaint. But I think it's still a pretty long road. This is what I was going to say. I think it's still a pretty long road to winding up with a big number like that, because the next stage of what's going to happen starting on Monday in front of the jury, I think Trump is going to be able to make some arguments that are more plausible at the next stage. And that's why these things are going to a jury. And at the next stage, they're not going to talk about whether he overvaluated these things or not, or whether that was fraudulent or not. But they're going to talk about, how do you quantify what the harms were? How do you quantify what the damages were? So Trump's going to, even though the court already found, for instance, that when he borrowed money against Mar-a-Lago and listed it as being worth $500 million, that was fraudulent. He's going to be able to say, yeah, but the loans that I got, even by perpetuating a fraud that enabled me to get the loans, I paid them back. So nobody was harmed by that. And that to the extent that he can make those kind of arguments that, even if I committed fraud, now we're at the stage of trying to quantify what were the damages, what were the harms, how did anybody lose money because of my frauds? I actually think it's going to be quite hard for the Attorney General to get up to a number as high as the 250 million that she's asked for.
Now, that leads me to a question on this one, right? Because generally when you're talking about civil suits like this and you have plaintiffs, the plaintiffs are another private party, right? And so they're the ones trying to ascertain the number because they're saying, look, this is the way in which it harmed me. It cost me this. How does that work when, in this case, the plaintiff is in fact the Attorney General, and how would you even begin to kind of not prosecute, but how would you begin to demonstrate those kinds of harms when you're not the person who's actually harmed? Like, how does that work? That's an honest question. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a good one because in New York law, the New York civil fraud statute does allow the Attorney General to stand in for the public. So if there were frauds perpetuated in New York, on New Yorkers or on really anyone who was in New York, then the New York civil fraud statute does allow the Attorney General to bring a civil action to recover damages, but the burden of quantifying the damages is the same as it would be on a private plaintiff. Right. So the mere fact that the Attorney General can prove fraud, which to this judge's satisfaction and mine, she already did, doesn't absolve her of also the obligation. OK, if you want to get a judgment for money damages for that fraud, you've got to prove out the harms and the damages. And so I think there's different mechanisms that might be used. And I'm sure there are going to be some damages. But I just think the big number that she asked for might be a reach. But, she probably will be able to find some people who lost money. Like you might think of, people, if you think of the Trump University case, which was, I think, even part of the pattern or practice of frauds that gets mentioned in the background here, there were a lot of people who paid money to take courses at Trump University. So, maybe every single one of them didn't pay enough money to bring their own lawsuit to get it back. But the total amount of money that all those people were defrauded out of, could be the kind of thing that it would be possible to get expert witnesses who can quantify that kind of thing and present evidence about it. In the case of some of the Trump properties, I think there were allegations along the lines of that they would literally lie about the value of comparable properties that had sold nearby. So they'd put a condo up and they'd say, well, this is $3 million, which is a real steal because the one next door sold for $4 million, which would be just a total lie, right? And so in situations like that, you can the buyers, if they overpaid because they were lied to like that, then there's harm to them. Now, I think with the banks and the creditors and then the investors, there's definitely going to be some who didn't get all their money back, and so the AG, if she can find them and figure out how much money they lost because of things that Trump told them that weren't true, all that will go into the mix. But the problem is, I think plenty of them probably did get their money back, and so if they made a loan because Trump wrote the wrong property valuation on a property and therefore they gave a mortgage against it, but then they received back the mortgage payments, then that's not going to be something that goes into the damages, I wouldn't think. So that's why I think that not every fraud that he committed is going to lead to, there wasn't going to be a high valuation of damages for every fraud he committed. But the AG is going to be held to a burden of proof of actually trying to quantify and prove out what were the damages from all his fraud.
Yeah, I think that's so important because, one, I think a lot of people just at a basic level don't understand the differences between those civil lawsuits and, kind of prosecutorial situations where you have criminal issues at stake. And so you're kind of maybe reading in criminal things. And then at the same time, again, like as I was asking you those kinds of questions, because you have to remember, in a civil case, as you're pointing out, having done something and found to be wrong is different than that kind of damages phase. And that's why I was very curious, because not every state has it so that you can have public redress in civil cases. As a matter of fact, what do you know what the breakdown is around the country? Like how many states have that or not?
I think most states, but not all, have statutes that are somewhat similar to New York's. But I think most states don't have, the resources that the New York Attorney General has.
Okay.
And so these would be very underutilized. Like I think.
So maybe that's why I'm not thinking of it as just in the fact of if you don't have if you don't have the plaintiff power, the pocketbook, you're just not going to see it happen on a regular basis.
Right, because the New York Attorney General's office would have a civil fraud unit. So, there's going to be prosecutors working full time on these civil fraud cases. And I think that may be something you don't see as much of in smaller states, even if they have a law that would allow for that. I don't have data on this, but my kind of gut sense is the New York statute may be a little bit on the more aggressive side compared to a lot of states, but that a lot of states have some kind of statute that would allow the Attorney General to protect generally consumers against frauds, because there are a whole category of cases that could come up in every state where businesses are engaging in fraudulent practices that are defrauding large numbers of people out of money, but not anybody out of enough money that they'd bring their own civil lawsuits. And so I think that's the kind of reason that the AGs usually do have some kind of authority like this.
Well, let me move us forward so that we can at least hit one more story, if nothing else, Ken. And that was that, this is something that we've covered a number of times now. And that was Alabama got denied by the U.S. Supreme Court in a short unwritten opinion from using its current electoral map in 2024. Now, to go back to what we talked about a while, as a matter of fact, I had interrogated you a little bit about what you thought was going to happen on this front way back when they were filing it. But effectively, Alabama was ordered to add a black district in their state. And effectively, they said, nope, we're not going to do that. And didn't do that. That was able to go through on a temporary basis. But then they still didn't do it. And so they were then brought back to court for having for defying the court's order. And this had come all the way now back to the Supreme Court to see what they were going to do. And one of the questions I was having was, what do you think is the likelihood what's going to happen? And I mean, the Supreme Court really didn't have an answer other than to say, no, we're not going to hear your appeal. You're going to have to go with the lower court. You're going to have to create the district. And I think a lot of people in the political commentary fronts were potentially, I think maybe you were one on this kind of front. And the last time we had talked, I didn't have a chance to review all of your comments, Ken, so I'll let you speak for yourself. But, you had been a little bit worried that a more corrupt Supreme Court or a few of the corrupt Supreme Court justices in your terms would come in and maybe save Alabama. But that doesn't seem to have happened here. So do you have any thoughts on it's always a weird thing. What are your thoughts on the lack of a comment from the Supreme Court?
Well, let me say, I think when we talked about it before, which was the first time that the Supreme Court had the case and sustained the 11th Circuit ruling, I was pleasantly surprised that time. And that's what you're really remembering. I actually thought that that despite what I thought was a very clear violation of the only provision of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has not already struck down, I thought that they would just use this as the vehicle to finish striking down the rest of the Voting Rights Act,
right.
and then they didn't do that. So I think I stood corrected that first time around. Now this time around, if we talked about it again, what are they going to do on the second go round? I think I would have said, or I can't remember if I did say anything, but I would have expected that once the Supreme Court ruled the first time around, they weren't going to change their mind on it. So they had already really taken what was an unexpected and big step to say we're still going to allow enforcement of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act that say if a state legislature purposely draws a map in a way that's designed to not let African Americans have the same voting power as white people, that violates the Voting Rights Act. That's an illegal map, and so that has been the standard. The federal district court in this case found very clear evidence that this particular map in Alabama had been a racial gerrymander, specifically with borders specifically drawn to make sure that African Americans, who are almost half the population of Alabama, couldn't elect more than one of the is it 7? They have 7 seats or 8 seats. I can't remember how many seats.
I thought I had this here. 7 or 8. I did not write that down.
Yeah. I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 seats, but the point is African Americans are almost half the people in the state, and they couldn't elect even more than one African American. And the district court found facts proving out that was a racial gerrymander. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is it's a conservative court of appeals, and this particular panel had 3 Republican judges on it. They all sustained the district court's findings. The Supreme Court, normally would not involve itself in second-guessing factual findings. So I think when it came up to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court was going to accept the idea that this was a racial gerrymander, but what they were really going to rule on was whether we still have a rule against racial gerrymanders or not. And in the case, they said, yeah, we still do have a rule against racial gerrymanders, and we accept that this was a racial gerrymander. So this needs to go back down, and these districts need to be redrawn. Now, after the Supreme Court said that, the kind of naked intransigence that the Alabama legislature engaged in after that, just simply refusing to follow a court order that had been entered by the district court in Alabama, affirmed by a unanimous panel on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and affirmed by a majority in the U.S. Supreme Court, they still wouldn't adhere to it. I think at that point, it's a pretty foregone conclusion that, one principle that's even more important to the Supreme Court than any issue about the Voting Rights Act is that when they rule in a case, their ruling has to be implemented. Yeah. And that's really all this is about now.
No, I think that's excellent. And I think that's a great way to call it in for the show. So, Ken, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been a great show.
Well, so that's it for this week's Politics Guys. And I just want to say, if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I really hope you'll consider becoming one, right? That's what makes this podcast go. It makes me have these conversations with Ken. It's what makes it possible for Mike to do interviews with really cool books, or for me, where shortly we're going to have another book review out with Lainey Newman and her new book on Union Blues. That's possible because of supporters. And so I would love if you would make today a priority to become a supporter of the show. And I don't just say that in kind of an abstract way, right? Hey, support us because it matters, because we also offer you really cool things. So let me just list a few of the cool things you'll get if today you say, look, I do want to support the Politics Guys. You get things like our supporters exclusive midweek show. One of the really cool things here in just a few minutes, Ken and myself, we are going to get to break away from kind of the news things. We've been going through the U.S. Constitution for this entire year, and we're going to finish the original text of the Constitution with Article 7. We'd love for you to join us. And then, hey, you're not out of luck. You can always go back, listen to all those shows, get caught up, or maybe you want to start joining us because you're really more interested in civil liberties and you want to talk about the Bill of Rights. Well, guess what we're going to be doing after we get done with the full text here and Article 7, we're going to be heading into the Bill of Rights. We're going to head into all the amendments. So we've got a lot more time to go. That supporter exclusive midweek show is one of the benefits you get when you become a supporter of the Politics Guys. And I know that's a lot of fun for me, and I'd love for you to be a part of that. Supporters get other cool things as well. You're going to be a part of our active Discord group. I was talking about that earlier in the show. I listen to what's going on in Discord. We have conversations there, and then that affects what we do here on the show. So I would love to be talking with you two personally on Discord and get to know you a little bit better. So again, to get all of this stuff, and there's other things too, like Politics Guys gear, you just got to head to patreon.com/politics guys. Again, that's patreon.com/politics guys. You can take a look at all the different levels of support. You can decide what you want to give and what level you want to be and what you're going to get in return for that, besides just the good feeling of knowing that you are a part of the Politics Guys family. Now, if Patreon is not your jam, don't forget, there's other ways of supporting as well. You can support us on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can support the show through PayPal. All of those support links are in the show notes. Or, of course, you can head to our website at politicsguys.com/support. So again, if you want to see all those levels, head on to patreon.com/politics guys, or just go ahead and scroll down to the show notes and click right there, and you can see what it can get for you. Now, if you'd like to get that midweek show, but you're just not in a position to financially do that right now, that is not a problem at all. Just shoot us an email at mail@politicsguys.com and we can get you set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the Politics Guys, rating this episode, reviewing this episode on the podcast app of your choice means the world. And again, sharing these things on social media is a big deal too. Now, if you've got questions, comments, corrections, gripe, or anything else you'd like to share with us, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys.com. We try to get back as quick as we can. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. You can DM us there. You'll find the links in the show notes. And it just occurs to me, there is no Twitter. You can get us on Facebook, or the thing formerly known as Twitter, X, and you'll find all of that in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are a wonderful group. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. Thank you guys each so much. We'll be back with a brand new episode. I hope you'll join us then.